Great. Well, thanks for everybody for joining us. I'm Arlen Meyers. I'm the president and CEO of the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs and work along with the folks at AIMed. Thanks for joining us for this conversation about artificial intelligence and the future of the healthcare workforce. Bob, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Arlen. I'm an internal medicine physician by trade. I have actually a background in research, private practice, and 20 years of active duty medical service. Um, my really forte used to be health informatics, but I transitioned largely to data science and AI about 8 years ago. I'm core faculty for the American Board of AI and Medicine, along with Anthony Chang.
And Todd, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Morning, everyone. My name is Todd McGuire, and I'm in Denver, Colorado. And I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Data Methods. And my background is all on the software and the startup and builder side of things. I've been a technical founder of multiple companies and build a lot of the technology and data plumbing that harnesses a lot of the clinical expertise from people that might be on the call today, but translating that into the sometimes messy world of startups and agile methodologies, and really excited to bring that part of the kind of the founder and the technology AI lens into the discussion today.
Great. So this conversation is really going to be about what I would propose as AI roles, holes, and goals as it applies to the workforce. And by that, I mean that artificial intelligence obviously has challenged everybody, including the healthcare workforce, as to what new roles are evolving or necessary. What are the holes in terms of preparedness, workforce development, learning and development, personal competencies, what problems are arising, et cetera. And finally, the goals. I mean, what is the point of all of this? Most of us would say, well, it's to achieve the sextuple or quintuple aims: reduce cost, increase quality, equitable access, provider or clinician experience, patient experience. And I add an additional one because it has to do with shareholder value, because there's so many companies that are now basically in bed with sick care companies and they're for-profit companies, and the whole point of it is to generate shareholder value, which creates a lot of conflict in the ethics of medicine and the ethics of business. So there's a lot to talk about, and it's apropos that we're having this conversation today, because 3 days ago, a fairly controversial article appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association that was authored by Ezekiel Manuel, that basically is a bioethicist at the University of Pennsylvania. And there are a couple of other authors that were basically big deal stakeholders in AI companies. But the basic gist of the argument was AI is going to replace doctors. And they made a whole lot of arguments why that is so. So if you haven't seen that article, it's in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And there are ways that you can get to it. And if you can't, then there are various places you can go to that can. So Bob, we've distributed that article prior to both you and Todd. So Bob, as someone who's involved primarily in education, whether it's bioinformatics or artificial intelligence or the things that we're talking about, what is your response to that article?
Well, actually, my criticism of that article is not so much with methodologies and challenges with AI. There's two major that Anthony Chang and I objected to the ability of the authors. When you look at the authors, number one, there are no practicing physicians. One is the CEO of Cure AI, which basically is promoting autonomous AI, a virtual patient visit, in other words, without a clinician. The other fourth person is the father of this person, who's a credibility in regard, and they have. The second thing is in the title, you see for the best medical care is the end of the title. Well, again, AI can definitely help with some cognitive task. Make no mistake about it. It will help be more efficient, but cognitive task is only a small part of what clinicians do. And notice I'm using the word clinicians, not physicians, because anybody who touches the patient, in a sense, is a clinician. And there's so much more that goes on in the care of a patient than just having the communicate well. You have to be there for the tough times of grieving, death, explaining difficult. There's just so much in patient relationships to build trust and confidence that has nothing to do with the diagnosis. So again, I think, again, we need good articles. It's a challenge to produce good articles because by the time they're published, often we're 2 generations ahead with large language models. So this is a very difficult area. And I think we need the input of the technical people, but definitely need the insight of the clinicians. And I think that I've said enough.
So just as a side note, if those in the audience have questions and they want to ask something, please do in the chat and Becca will tee it up.
Bob's audio was a little off. I think there's an issue. I'm not sure how to correct that, Bob.
Yeah, Bob, you're a little bit breaking up, so I'm not. Maybe it has to do with people that are unmuted or unmuted.
All participants are muted.
Okay, great. All right.
Might be the video, if it's still choppy, Bob, maybe next time try just dimming your video for a minute. That might be just taking bandwidth, if that's what it sounds like on my end.
Yeah, okay. So Todd, so you're a technologist. You've had experience in building data platforms, data architect, et cetera, experience in healthcare. So what is your perspective on all of this from the technology side?
It's an interesting dynamic to watch because I see a convergence. Maybe it's some very similar parallels to just what's happening in general in the tech space. Just separate kind of the clinician lane for a minute, and it feels very similar. Like the article that came out recently from Harvard Business Review, just talking about the normal career arc is over, and going through that, I see exactly the same thing happening in the tech space as is happening in the clinical side, where there's a big shift from planning to preparation. And the planning days were when we had a bit of certainty and a bit of procedural steps were probably going to happen. It said, okay, if I do this first, and in a clinical setting, if I go through and get my residency, get my fellowship, and follow this, I move into this role, and after 4 years, I move to that role. That contract has kind of splintered, and same thing has happened on the tech world. You used to go into computer science and say, I'm going to go get my computer science degree, maybe get a master's in data science and just be in that role. Then I go from a junior engineer to a senior engineer. And that contract has been broken. And I think it's replaced with this preparation idea. And I like the subtlety of planning versus preparation. The difference in my mind is, one is when things are certain that they're going to happen a predictable way, and one is when it's uncertain. You've got to kind of pack your toolbox for what might be on the road ahead. If you're like a 14er here in Colorado 2 weekends ago, and you pack some stuff that it's a sunny day, but what if it gets windy and you get stuck on the mountain? You got to be ready. So it feels like the same thing is happening, and there's a big white space. It's frustrating, but I think it's an opportunity where the normal resume world is broken and the normal matching world is broken, because you've got traditional, like in the medical world, 30-page CVs that just define every single thing you've done. But on the other side, you've got a founder And I've been that founder that is looking for clinical expertise, but somebody that also knows how to fit in with an entrepreneurial mindset, knows what agile thinking is when it comes to iterating. And that's pretty different. And I think even the matching is wrong. Like on LinkedIn, you've got just keyword matches. If you type in what your background is and you say, I'm looking for this kind of job, some of these roles didn't even exist 12 months ago. And so the match is broken. So it's I think it's kind of a bit frightening, but a bit of exciting white space that's in front of us.
Bob, can you hear us? Or are you checking in on a different computer? Not yet. So let's stick with this. So the way I see this is a couple things. One is that this has to do with personal, organizational, and systemic response to the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare. So if you are an individual physician or technologist or anyone that is interested in all this stuff, how do you close so this gets to the roles and the holes. So in other words, if you are looking for a non-clinical role, or you are a clinician looking for you don't want to leave medicine, but you want to supplement it with a side gig, which is like 40% of 45% of clinicians now. So having been on the receiving end and given what you're doing with your platform, what would you suggest? How do clinicians close the competency gaps when they're applying for these jobs? And what do people that are looking for those people need to know? Because I think it's a two-sided coin. There are gaps in how new companies or startups are looking for clinicians, and there are gaps in how clinicians are approaching potential side gig users. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think you're right on, Arlen. Like you've got people speaking two different languages and kind of passing in the dark, looking for each other. But the founders at the startups are describing, where they need this clinical insight to, help guide LLM model selection for a new product. And you've got a person on the clinical side that probably has that deep expertise, and maybe it's in a domain that's exactly what they're looking for, but they're not even matching with that. They're not even seeing that. And if they do get that first conversation to happen, I think relying on the old method of my 30-page CV is just going to numb the listener on the founder side. They don't understand that. They're going to get lost in the noise. Part of what I think is the white space that with our clinicalpivots.com platform we're trying to do is say, the resume is necessary but not sufficient to solve the problem. So you need to go through and do a readiness assessment that takes your clinical background or your medical background as table stakes. It has nothing to do with if dermatology is your specialty, how good are you at that? That's a given, but it really gets into what's your entrepreneurial mindset? What's your financial position for this? Are you looking at the fractional world? I was just talking with a company yesterday, a founder in the diabetes space that really is looking for kind of a fractional team to go and bring this on. Well, kind of, do you know what that means? Do you know how to kind of navigate that? So doing an assessment of the finder, the clinician trying to make the pivot, and being honest about kind of where they stand and where their gaps are, and not being surprised that there are some gaps, but expecting it, because this is a brand new territory. Nobody has all the boxes checked yet. But then taking that and matching it, and this is where kind of the fun AI comes in, is most things that happen, if you go onto Indeed or LinkedIn, it's what I would call keyword matching. It's the old-fashioned relational database type of way of saying, if Arlen's looking for apples and then there's someone posting a job that says I have apples, it matches. We're taking an approach of using what's called a semantic match, where it's just the meaning. And it says, oh, I am a clinician and I want to use these skills, but I don't want to be bedside anymore. And I don't want to just be doing administrative processing at big healthcare. What does that really mean? And how does it align with a tech founder trying to build a nimble startup in their health domain? to do that, you need to match the meaning of what the founder is talking about, but he won't use the right words, and what the clinician expert is talking about, and they're going to be talking in the old CV language. And so that type of glue, I think, is a huge opportunity on both sides to make it better.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and one had to do with did the article just basically have to do with primary care? And I think the tone of it was mostly primary care, but frankly, I think it applies to all whether it's primary care, specialty care, behavioral health, wherever you happen to be. I think this really has to do more with process mapping and workflow. And the problem is we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole by applying artificial intelligence to old workflow and process mapping when it really needs to change to accommodate the infrastructure, because it's no longer an innovation. And people have commented on this. What happens when AI goes from an innovation to infrastructure? It's like, what happened after the internet became infrastructure? So we really have to sort of rethink the process. And I think that applies to everybody. Now, one of the questions, and Bob, maybe you can answer this, is who do you think is on the bubble? I mean, if you're a proceduralist, because basically clinicians do 3 basic or 4 basic things. They do cognitive tasks and aggregate data, and then make decisions. They do procedures or some sort of intervention, and they will, for lack of a better term, communicate with patients, the things that Bob related to, empathy, communication, stay at the bedside or the website, whatever it happens to be. So I think it applies to everybody. It's just some are less at risk. Now, I'm a surgeon by background, so you could say, well, you pretty much have job security if you're a surgeon. Well, I'm not so sure. Given robotic surgery, and we can get into that conversation. But Bob, what is your take on that? Who's on the bubble?
Well, the article points out that those that are proceduralists, and you've already mentioned cardiologists and surgeons, are seemingly at lower risk just because AI can't do a cardiac catheterization. It also clearly doesn't have any ability to see or feel patients at this point. It's not
Unfortunately, you're still
so I
breaking
think
up.
it's a task. I mean, they may apologize. I turned the video off. I'm literally 10 feet from my router. I have no idea what the problem suddenly is.
All right. Well, this sounds a little bit better. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm not sure what the issue is.
Okay.
But I think the article, though, starts off saying that AI is better reviews, aggregating data and whatnot. But as I pointed out earlier, there's a lot more to medicine than that. And it's not just procedures either. The taking care of a patient is highly involved. And AI, again, is going to be an important tool without a question. But I think those people that do procedures, like you're an otolaryngologist, you're pretty protected.
Yeah. So let's address this. And Bob, maybe you can address sort of one of the questions, and that is, the academic medical centers are really struggling to catch up with workforce preparedness for this. What suggestions do you have, whether you are in private practice or not, or whether you are an employed physician or not, in various employed physician companies, for lack of a better word? For example, academic medicine versus being a private equity-owned hospital versus a rural hospital, and these various, or a safety net hospital. How can clinicians prepare themselves, or should they prepare themselves for these changing roles, regardless of their practice situation?
Well, I don't think there's any question that all practicing clinicians need to be aware of what's available out there, but also should be aware of the limitations. And then it becomes a real question, well, how do you do that? I mean, obviously, I'm part of the American Board of AI in Medicine, so we want people to take courses, that our course or whatever course, but they have to be aware of what's currently out there and the trends, and even the popular trends, such as clinical decision support with say, open evidence or Doximity Ask. They need to be aware of the limitations of that. And even the issue of ambient scribes, which are really popular in this country, realize that in essence, they're a break-even proposition. You only see maybe a quarter more patients per week. So from purely a return on investment, if you're a CEO, ambient scribes don't make that much sense, but they're a great appeal. They're a great appeal to clinicians because they save time, not a huge amount of time, but are going to be at a recruiting disadvantage. And unfortunately, rural hospitals fit that description in all aspects of AI. They cannot be as competitive, unfortunately.
So I would remind people that people have described the 70-20-10 rule, which is how adults learn. And, we've talked about data literacy, which is basically understanding the basic lingo and lexicon of artificial intelligence, and data dexterity, which is applying those things. But the fact that the literature in adult learning reinforces that 70% of adult learning happens from experience. In fact, Julius Caesar noted that experience is the only teacher. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, but it has to do a lot, and certainly in medical education. That's why we do residencies. It's called clinical judgment. So 70% of adult learning, let's just agree, is learned from experience. The second is 20% of adult learning is from each other, the people that you come in contact with in your network. These kinds of things that we're doing now, comparing experiences, and can you give me some tips, and what have you tried, and what works and what doesn't, all that. And 10% is learned in a classroom or in a classroom environment, most of which you're going to forget 10 minutes after you leave the class. So the point is that you can learn anything you want now on the internet for free. But the point is, you really have to put yourself in the situation where you're experiencing using it and applying it under some sort of peer support or guidance, or it's like an apprenticeship model that we use for residency, which I think is sort of a gap in the educational ecosystem. So, Todd, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And one quick point on the experience and like decision making that always makes me chuckle is the saying that good decisions come from experience, and experience comes from bad decisions. And I kind of like that kind of the humility of that journey of like as getting into this this AI world. We all have to get the experience, and the good news is almost nobody has a long depth of experience in the outside of kind of the AI research world, and definitely in the world of translating clinical background into this next frontier. I think it totally is. We're all kind of at the starting line, and it feels like an opportunity, maybe a reality is if you look at the skill sets, and kind of the kind of your 70-20-10 layout. I love those buckets, and take that as your starting point. Then you take where I think a lot of this next wave of roles live, and 100% for sure on the fractional side. Like almost all of these fractional types of things and the side gigs that are growing more and more. I think those those all live in this either new space of a new builder creating a new company. And even in some cases, some of the big health, big tech companies that are incubating within and saying, hey, we want to be nimble and agile. And so in either of those cases, it feels like looking at some of the data of what we're seeing, because we've set up this kind of daily harvest AI engine that's just looking for emerging companies and the emerging roles in non-clinical settings in those companies. And it's like there's an unbundling happening of the tasks that typically were all in the bucket of a clinician, and now they're being spread out, saying, well, we need your clinical insight, but we also need you to be comfortable with what model selection would make the most sense. And there's a new role that just came out that was a clinical advisor and LLMs and AI. I mean, that role didn't exist probably 12 months ago, maybe even fewer, but now it's out there. And I would argue that there's no one that knows right off the bat how to do that job perfectly, but with some gap filling on the concept of frontier models that are expensive and you're using a third party to process it versus private models that might be, they're definitely cheaper, but they let you control the data, like that kind of a knowledge. And maybe it's in your 20% bucket, learning from each other. And it's kind of the, there's a mastermind element to what we're doing with clinical pivots. We're trying to just bring in the founders, the funders, and the finders and get them to talk and say, oh, here's how I was able to translate my clinical into good advice on AI model selection in that role. And that's not a new job as much as it's just unbundling of some of the previous tasks that clinician did and weaving it into this newer kind of startup ecosystem.
So maybe Bob and Todd, you could chime in on this, but this issue of, so what do I need to do to get a side gig? Regardless of the clinical situation that you're in, employed or independent, regardless of whether that side gig is working with or for an AI company or using artificial intelligence to work for some other kind of company, it really doesn't matter. And this has to do with using it as an intrapreneur in addition to possibly using it as an entrepreneur. The difference being, if you are an intrapreneur, you are an employed person trying to act like an entrepreneur within your organization to add value to that organization. And I'm talking about now 75% of practicing clinicians being employed. So most of their activity is going to be within the organization, not working for Google or whatever, a startup, wherever it may be. But that does not preclude you, if you are an employed physician, from doing a side gig in addition to. So this is not an either or decision. It's an and decision. And it comes with risks and benefits, which we don't have time to get into right now, because that's into the non-clinical career webinar. But that's the point that I'm trying to make. It's not an either or decision. You can do both, and you can chew gum and walk at the same time, but it takes certain things. The second point I would say is that, the traditional medical education hierarchy, which dates back to medieval times, it relies on the traditional triple aim or the triple threat. If you're recruited for a position as a department chair or a dean or whatever, it's going to be your clinical expertise, translation, how much money can you make seeing patients, your research capability, translation, how much money are you bringing in NIH grants, and education, translation, how many publications do you have, and your teaching awards and all the other stuff. When in fact, we don't teach people how to teach. It's an unfunded mandate in medical education. And some people do it well, as in anything, and some people are terrible at it. But that's what you have to do to get a job. So my argument is, in the brave new world, the new triple threat, and this applies to intrapreneurs, extrapreneurs, trying to get a clinical side gig is clinician. Yes, you need subject matter clinical expertise. Technologist, yes, you need some working background and knowledge of medical technology and information systems. And 3, entrepreneur. You need to know how to add value through the deployment of innovation. So the new triple threat, as far as I'm concerned, clinician, technologist, entrepreneur. Now, we don't teach people in traditional medical training how to do those things. And Bob, since you're sort of, and I do this and Bob does it and other people, so what do you see as the primary barriers and how to overcome them when it comes to identifying and treating what has been referred to as academia?
Well, one thing I want to point out is there are a lot of young physicians who are bright and want to be involved with side gigs and startups. And that traditionally, though, their benefit has been largely their clinical experience. They have not had to be that tech savvy. In other words, technology companies have often hired doctors and nurses because they understand how clinics work, hospitals work, patient flow. They understand all those non-technical issues that make them very valuable. So I want to maybe do away with the impression that any clinician who wants to be involved in AI must be an expert in AI. That's really not the case. They have to be curious, they have to be tenacious, and they do have to have some education, don't get me wrong, but their understanding of medicine makes them very valuable.
So how do you respond to the criticism, or actually the observation that's derived from research, that in fact, when a clinician interacts with artificial intelligence, their decision-making deteriorates? That was one of the arguments in the JAMA article. And it's been seen in other industries, because a lot of people now are comparing AI alone, human AI. And it's been observed that when people encounter things that generated by artificial intelligence, essentially they get dumber. They make worse decisions. Has that been your experience, Todd?
Well, first of all, I think the studies are very limited. There's that one study on de-skilling in gastroenterology out of Europe, out of one of the journals. And I think that, that one article really was pervasive in terms of news outlets and whatnot. I think that we need other studies to look at that. There's no question that people call that cognitive offloading, the fact that it saves you time. But at the same time, it could interfere with teaching critical thinking in medical school residency and whatnot. But I think we need better studies to know what exactly is de-skilling or never skilling. How common is it? And does it affect all students, all practicing clinicians? I don't think we know that without more studies. We're still new in the game.
Todd, you want to comment?
Yeah, I think it's a very boundary spanning question, because I even run into it. I've got 3 young kids in middle school and high school, and AI is right at the intersection of that, baby steps of the education journey. And just last night I was working with one of my twin boys on algebra, and we're going through and he's getting ready for a test, and his temptation is to go get the answer from AI. And my relentless negotiation with him is, you can't use it that way. You can outsource the reading to AI, but you can't outsource the understanding. So what you can use it as is an infinitely patient teacher, and this is in that education sense, where it says, help me get through this. I think the same thing happens crossing over into the systems design world and in kind of the medical world, where I use AI every hour of every day in building the systems and companies that I've built. And in every hour of every day, it's right 85% of the time and it's wrong 15% of the time, and it's foundationally wrong 15% of the time. It's directionally wrong. It's picking, it's going down a rabbit hole that if I had my hand off the wheel, it would be disastrous. And what I remind myself of, and I talk to groups that I work with on this point, and it gets to the understanding of what AI and in particular large language model, generative AI like ChatGPT, Claude, what they are doing is probabilistic, and it's not deterministic like all of our other systems where we knew if you asked it the same question, you'd always get the same output, kind of an expert system approach. These new AI systems being probabilistic, they might say a different thing. And a kind of a funny example, but it hits the point home, is anyone who's read about synergy as an idea will see what I would call the math equation of synergy is 1 + 1 = 3. That's what the idea is about. So if you had a bunch of blog articles written about synergy and they use that little math equation, and you had an AI trained on that, and you then asked it, what is 1 + 1? With a straight face, it would say 3, because it doesn't really know what 1 is. It doesn't know what 3 is. And I think the same thing is at play in this original question of a clinician with no AI, AI with no clinician, and then the combination. Depending on, and I think, Bob, you hit on this, like we don't know the details of how those clinicians were using AI, but if they were using it like my 15-year-old twin boys that are just trying to get an answer, I think that is making us dumber. If you're using it as an infinitely patient teacher and researcher and bringing in more data points than I ever could have processed as a human, but I'm still cognitively, critically thinking about it, I don't see that as making us dumber, but it's all in the nuance.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. If I could add to that, this year we published a study on open evidence, and we looked at reproducibility, which has not really been published much. So we looked at the answers. These were now 10 choices, multiple choice questions with 10 potential answers. And the concordance between two different runs was in the 70%, whether we use regular open evidence or the deep consult. So that's another thing. It is probabilistic, and people need to understand that. It's giving you their best determination. And so that's another area. And I agree with what you said, Todd, about your children and how you educate them. The same would be true of peer review. There's no question AI could help peer review, but if you rely solely on peer review, you have really lost out. You've done a great disservice to a journal because, again, as Arlen pointed out, your experience is paramount. Your intuitiveness, your ability to know where a subject matter fits in, is it relevant, is super important. So the AI does pick up methodology problems in the references. It does a great job of certain things. But the overall gestalt of the article remains with the human.
So there's a question. So a couple of points I want to add. I put some things in the chat. There's a conversation going on in the medical education pedagogy literature about how learning models are changing. And if you're not familiar with that, they basically come down to the differences between pedagogy, what's referred to as andragogy, and hudagogy. Now, you may not be familiar with those terms, but basically, pedagogy is what we've been used to for the last 2,000 years. In other words, I tell you what you're supposed to learn and how you're supposed to learn it and why you're supposed to learn it as the teacher. And we could get into the conversation of, in the age of AI, what's the value of a teacher? But again, that's another subject. But that's the first. That's what most of us have grown up with. Like, here's the stuff, here's the test, here, memorize it, spit it back, and here's how you're going to do it. Well, that has evolved, at least recently, into andragogy, which is self-directed, a little bit more self-directed learning, but I'm still telling you what you need to learn. Here's what's going to be on part 1 of the national boards. Here's what's going to be on part 2 of the national boards. Here are the subjects that are going to be covered. And it's up to you to figure out how to learn all that stuff. And I'll give you some maybe practice tests or something like that to do it. So you can pass part 1, 2, et cetera, get a residency. Well, the latest take on all of this is something called heutagogy, which derives from the same word as heuristics. It's in other words, how do you structure learning? And it comes down to the student is tasked, to Todd's point, with his kids, what, how, and why to learn. So you're an algebra teacher, and you're trying to teach his kids algebra. Well, the first question is, why do you think you need to learn algebra? And that's it. You have this conversation with the kids, and well, I don't know. I don't even know what algebra is. Well, how would you find out what algebra is? It's that whole process of self-directed learning. And the second thing I would mention is that so how do you get around making bad decisions when you have AI at your side, when it's the guide at the side, or a teacher for that matter, which for all intents and purposes, I mean, I consider myself sort of a placebo as a teacher these days, because I'm just there. I mean, you can learn whatever you want. You don't need me. I'm there for other stuff. I'm helping you get up to the top of Mount Everest. You can do it yourself if you want, but you're going to be a lot better if you have me helping you. So it's really more mentoring and support and reinforcement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a guide at the side. But the one of the ways, or two of the ways to do this is to avoid that is, number one, part of the entrepreneurial mindset is something called associating. And that means, how do you make sense out of the world? What is your field of vision of the world? Or do you have a wide open lens and you're looking at everything that's going on in the world? Society, technology, economics, stuff going on in other industries, et cetera, and you're trying to make sense of how does all that fit in my world? How do I interpret that sensory experience and incorporate it into my decision making? And they're very, very few. In other words, sick care can't be fixed from inside. And if you have a fixed mindset instead of a growth mindset, you're not going to be able to incorporate other things that will help your decision making. So number one, develop an associative mindset. And there are ways to do that, to practice that. We don't have time to go into it, but you can. The second is to bring your personal perspective into what decision you're making. And don't rely on looking in the rearview mirror of AI to make the decision. So in other words, again, Todd's kids, it's a good example. So here's the algebra problem. Here's a quadratic equation. And I mean, we all went through this. If you went to medical school, you had to. You're up in calc, all that stuff. So the idea is, well, why do you think this is important? I mean, why would you want to learn quadratic equations? And how does that have anything to do with it? But you have to add your own personal perspective. Then you can go to artificial intelligence and say, why should I learn algebra? And it's going to give you a gazillion reasons. Because we'd never get to the moon if we didn't know algebra, because you wouldn't be able to, whatever, build a house or whatever it takes. So those are the basic skill sets. And this gets to this question in the chat. Well, how do I learn this stuff? What about an MBA? Short answer, I think it's worthless. In fact, I think it's a particular skill set to be successful as a physician entrepreneur or as an AI side gig, despite your MBA. And we can get into all kinds of conversations about that. But no, bottom line, don't let school get in the way of your education. What about certifications? I think with all due respect, I think in a lot of credentialitis is rampant. Doctors are suckers for credentials. So in terms of marketing, it's a good scam because you pay the money, you get the paper, but so what? Does that give you a competitive advantage in the marketplace? I would argue it does not. You could put all the letters after you want, after your name, But as we're saying, at the end of the day, it really has to do with your demonstrating competencies. Again, it's market person fit. Here's what this potential employer is looking for. How do you know that? You read the job description, because that will tell you, here's the things we want people to do and the people we are looking for to do this job. Comments, Todd or Bob?
Yeah, I love your joke. Don't let school get in the way of your education. And I would go back to a point you made earlier, talking about like the gig economy and the side hustle side of things. And you made the comment, can you do both? You said it's okay. I'd almost take that another step further and say you need to do both. And kind of going back to that planning versus preparation side of, we can all feel the land changing underneath our feet, and forcing yourself to get exposed to that kind of current of non-classroom education, I think is going to be fantastic. And in one way that I could kind of draw this, kind of come full circle and bridge between the software world and the medical world is, you've got the triple aim, and I always chuckle when it goes up to the quadruple and however many, but I'm old fashioned. I just think of the triple aim of like care, quality, and access. Software had its triple aim, 30, 40 years ago, kind of a golden triangle of features, budget, and time. If you want to build a system, every client wants it on this date with all the features and no more than this budget. And you can't usually get there. That's where half the projects have failed. So I always tell them, only pick two. You can't optimize all three. And if you want to hit your time and hit your budget, we're going to have to start haircutting the features. And I've always felt the same about the triple aim. Like it sounds so noble and perfect, and who wouldn't want better quality, better access, and lower costs? But historically, you couldn't move all three of those levers that way together. Some of them work against each other. But now in the middle of that triangle, I put AI might change the dynamics and change the physics and gravity of what can be done. And going to your whole point about your kind of career arc and have that associative growth mindset, think about that in the lens of your medical domain and the AI world, and even the triple aim. And I think there's white space in there to go find the mastermind for, or find the side gig for, where you can align to it and kind of create that future.
Okay, so Gary has brought up, and thanks for your comment, Gary, about clinical champions. And let me just make a couple comments and chime in about clinical champions. So the traditional wisdom is, if you don't have a clinical champion, if you're a tech company, if you're a med tech company or an AI company, and you're trying to find customers, collaborators, pilot sites, all that stuff, you're trying to get somebody to basically work through the gatekeepers to get noticed through all the noise. Just a couple of experiential offerings, because I've been on both sides of this. One is, there's some hospital systems that specifically tell you, we don't want clinical champions. We don't want you to say to get the head of the Department of Radiology bugging us all the time with your company's whatever, because that's not the way we vet and decide which companies we're going to interact with. So you need to understand the culture of an individual hospital or hospital system. Some will say, we don't want that either. If you have something that you want us to consider in our clinical innovation platform, then just go to the website and submit it. Don't even think of calling us about it, because we get 50 of these a day. And don't bug us with it. So my first point is, if you've seen one hospital and how they vet ideas, you've seen one hospital. So you need to understand the culture of how the process works, because there are like 8 people in the decision tree on the buying group, and they all want something different. So you have to sort of figure that out. The second point I would make is, so then, if you are in a situation where you think you need a clinical champion, how do you find them? I mean, how do you do that? And that has to do with networking, and it has to do with building relationships, and it has to do with picking people not because they're hood ornaments, which is what I refer to as doctors who simply are key opinion, not simply, they're key opinion leaders, they're subject matter experts, they're the professor of this and that, they're the president of this and that association, and they wind up with a picture on the website of the startup because people want to take advantage of their social equity. That's a problem because they're really not going to add a whole hell of a lot to what you're trying to do. They're just there for many, many reasons, not the least of which is sometimes they get paid to do it. So that's another way of kind of looking at this. But essentially it comes down to building networks before you need them, in the sense of, and I don't mean need them. I don't like the idea of you're building networks because you want something from someone. It's a reciprocal relationship, and you have to develop that relationship over time, but you really need to do it before you have to. I mean, if you're figuring, well, I have 3 people on my LinkedIn profile without a picture of me on it, and now I'm doing a startup and I'm looking for people to be on an advisory board, that's not going to work. It's just not going to work. So you have to sort of do this. And the final point I'll make is that you have to take the long view in all of this. These things don't happen overnight. I mean, how long has it taken you to become a doctor, for God's sakes? 15 years? Now all of a sudden you would be a startup techie. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to develop these things. And I would also remind you that you have transferable skills, durable skills as a clinician. There's a lot of things that you bring to the table in terms of durable skills, so-called soft skills. They're not soft, they're hard. They're hard to develop. We call them that. I don't know why, but we do. It's really the hard skills that are going to get you.
It's like common sense.
Yeah, it's like the career.
It's not that common.
It's clinical judgment that takes you 5 years to find a bathroom after you get out of your residency. You don't know anything. So it takes you a long time to sort of develop these skills, and the sooner you can do it, the better. So we could talk a lot about clinical champions, but I would just offer some of those caveats, and it's you've seen one.
Arlen, what about the chief AI officers? I think there are about 30 in the United States right now. That seems to be a trend. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I know Anthony and you and others in AP, they have strong opinions about that. I mean, my opinion of that is that many different organizations are struggling with this question. Who runs the show when it comes to integrating artificial intelligence into the organization, and dissemination and implementation when it comes to clinicians? I would tell you that overcoming the barriers to dissemination and implementation is the last mile, is the hardest. So you can create all the stuff you want. That's great. And even assuming that you have organizational readiness to disseminate and govern and manage and reward and recruit and all the stuff that goes into readiness, getting the end point to the patient means you have to convince the clinicians to do it, to adopt it. It's dissemination science. And fundamentally, it comes down to, in my view, the person that runs the show has to do, it's all local. It has to do with the structure and the organization. At IBM, for example, the chief AI officer is in human resources. In many organizations, that person is in IT. In other organizations, they're a clinical chief, like chief healthcare AI officer kind of thing. So I think it just really depends on the local, the assets on the ground, the culture, how it's structured, what are the unique problems, who has street cred. And ultimately it comes down to, is the organization willing and able to structure readiness? It's not a question of having too few inventions. It's a question of how do we disseminate them? How do we create a structure to allow it? And secondly, do the end users, that is the clinicians and all the other stakeholders, are they willing and able to use it? And fundamentally, everyone buys emotionally and justifies rationally. So there's a whole bunch of non-cognitive barriers to people like me not wanting to use it. And ultimately, it has to do with change management and fear. What are you afraid of if you use artificial intelligence in the clinic? Not the least of which is I'm afraid I'm training somebody to put me out of a job. So explain to me why I should do this. Explain to me who's going to pay for this. I don't get paid any extra to use this stuff, but you're rewarding my compensation package on productivity and all this other stuff. Why should I do this? And oh, by the way, you're telling me about patients that I really don't think are applicable to my patient population, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are significant barriers to the dissemination of information of technology, let alone artificial intelligence, and making bad technology adoption decisions. 80% of doctors, according to the latest poll, have had some experience with artificial intelligence. Now, that could be just looking up stuff for their kids on Google or Pilot or whatever, but at least they have some working knowledge, of what it is and that kind of thing. So those are just some other points. We're running out of time. And Bob, do you have a comment?
No.
Okay. So, Todd, any of the final thoughts? Words of wisdom, parting shots?
Yeah. Well, I like the point you made just now, Bob, about change management. And it kind of aligns with, Arlen, your point about like your LinkedIn profile. Like one of the things we're doing in the clinical pivots project is one of the dimensions is on personal brand. And one of the dimensions is on executive communication. I mean, those are not typical things you're going to find in a medical CV, definitely on the personal brand side, but they are coachable. They are gaps that you can fill, and they are a big piece of in big tech entrepreneur roles, and for sure in these small, nascent technologies. So I think I like kind of that getting out of the box of what the skills are to kind of thrive in what we have in front of us.
Okay, well, I really appreciate everybody's input. Thanks a lot for everybody's comments, and hopefully you found this, if not necessarily educational, at least somewhat inspiring. Remember, don't let school get in the way of your education. So the bottom line is you really kind of just need to go out there and do it, get experience. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Don't be afraid of looking stupid because you don't know anything about it. We've all been there. Learn from your mistakes, know when to pull the plug. But the last parting word I would say is start with the why. Like, why do you really want to do this? This is hard stuff. It takes a lot of time and effort, and it's brain damage. And so unless you're really convinced that this aligns with your personal moral compass or your career compass, do us a favor. Just see patients. So with that, we'll adjourn, and Rebecca is recording this, so hopefully you'll be able to locate it and download it to absorb anything you missed. So thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.